Hey all, Bynx here, and welcome to Bynx Bants, where we talk about everything Marvel Snap every single week. And we're going to start, as always, with our featured section. And this week we are going to be talking about the decks in Marvel Snap that have almost broken me over the years. I feel like Marvel Snap is a very, very well balanced game, and the dev team has really gotten good at being ahead of things and not letting really things get out of hand. But that hasn't always been the case, and there have been times where the meta has just been so degenerate that it feels like you can't do anything outside of either play a full counter to the best decks in the entire meta or just play the best decks in the entire meta. And as someone who likes to play weird, different, interesting decks, those times have been absolutely terrible for me. So I went through and I did a lot of research. This one was actually really fun to go back and actually find the original versions of these decks, just going through a lot of random YouTube videos, like best deck highlights, random other things that I found on Reddit, and actually finding good snapshots of deck lists of some of these absolutely degenerate decks. We are going to be actually breaking down into a top 5, so I'll give you 5 through 1. We're actually going to start with a few honorable mentions. The first honorable mention we're going to talk about is Cannonball Clog. This is actually one of the newest decks on this entire list, and this deck was really, really nasty. So one thing that you have to remember is that Professor X used to not allow cards to move into its lane. It would just fully lock down that lane. And the idea is that you would just build up some board space early on, try and clog your opponent with things like Debris, Green Goblin, and Titania. You can extend the game with Magic, and then at some point you land a Professor X to be able to lock up one of those lanes. So you can either utilize Daredevil and do it on turn 5, or a variety of different things. But after you would lock down that lane, essentially all you had to do was slam Cannonball in that other side, and it was a near guaranteed victory. So either you would knock the card that Cannonball would hit into the empty lane that you're not going after, or that lane will be full and the card will just die and turn into a rock. This deck just did some super nasty things. You could even use Dr. Octopus, which used to take as many cards as possible from your opponent's side to fill their lane, to just kind of throw one lane and stop your opponent from being able to do anything else. You Professor X the other lane that you're winning, and then you Cannonball the third lane to finish it off. This deck just felt so terrible to go against. You had Ravonna that can get an early Professor X off and discount your Green Goblin. You could just land a Nebula down that can grow over time. And then the Red Hulk that was in here is just a very big card in case you don't draw Cannonball. There's a lot of different variations of this, but this is the one that I found that was most true to what I really hated about this style of deck. It just felt like you were in a checkmate situation so many times, where just didn't matter what you did, as long as your opponent set up their combo well and they could even target it really well with Daredevil, you were just gone. Now, luckily, in June 15th, 2024, Professor X was changed so that cards can move there, thus pretty much refuting this entire side of the combo. It would take a really, really long time for Cannonball to get powerful again. Clog was pretty good, but then when Mercury came in, Cannonball once again became a problem. So really, really degenerate, really, really tough deck to beat here. Our next honorable mention is Leech Leader. Now, this one is a massive throwback. This one was all the way back in late 2022 that was really got pushed. I remember Darajin was one of the first people to really push this and put it out there, and everyone really gravitated to it because it just felt so overwhelming. So a lot of cards were different than they were back then, and you might look at some of these cards and think they're very weird and out of place. But Marvel Snap, I mean, we're looking hundreds of cards ago, so the overall power level was much, much brought down. So in the early spots, Sunspot was just one of the best 1-drops. We didn't really have too many good ones. Scorpion also just kind of one of the best 2-drops. It was a 2/2 that afflicted -1 to every card in your hand. Really hard to get value out of your 2-drops back then. You didn't really have the crazy scalers that we have nowadays, except for synergy decks. It had armor that was in here just to kind of block and stop destroy, which was one of the other stronger decks that was in there. And then Lizard at 2/5 was one of the most played 2-drops. Polaris was just a very powerful 3, and Maximus was just a very high power 3. Back then, a 3-7 was kind of crazy. Even a 3-5 was pretty nuts. But the real nuts and bolts of this deck land with Leech and Leader that have both been nerfed like crazy. But Leech used to be on reveal that would just completely silence every card in your opponent's hand. So it would just get rid of all the effects of all of the cards. So not like it does now where it's only 6 drops. There was a point where it was like just on reveals, but it would just clear and silence all of the cards in your opponent's hand. And then on the final turn, you could play Leader, which now only takes the biggest card that your opponent plays. But back then, Leader used to just play everything that your opponent played. So if your opponent played 6 cards on the final turn, Leader would copy them all. And not only that, if you didn't have priority, Leader would copy them all and reactivate all of their on reveal abilities to just make them actually like just insane. Leader was just this crazy broken card back then. And Leech was just this kind of linchpin way to just throw cards out early on and then stop all of your counters that your opponents would play, because there'd be a bunch of different ways that you try and fight Leech. You know, you could do things like trying to Cosmo it. But if you get leeched on turn 5, none of those things work. So really interesting. This is by far the oldest deck. This was like the first like real problem deck, I feel like. I think this is in like the second round of nerfs ever in Marvel Snap. It was right after the original release of the game. There was one that happened like in beta right before the game released. But man, dude, I just have so many funny memories of going against this deck, and it just felt so terrible. Just get your whole hand leeched and then just have them play everything that you play on the final turn. Really tough deck to beat. Really tough deck to get rid of. And then the Leader itself was nerfed on January 30th, 2023. And actually, there was a really weird time where Leader got changed to a 6-7 that worked as like a Guardians of the Galaxy kind of, where it would take the location to the right of it. It would copy any of your cards your opponents played there. So it was like kind of a little different, where you could like fight for 2 lands and still play a Leader. That card was really bad. Didn't really see any play until it got reworked into the Leader that we have today. But really powerful, really mean deck. It's always funny looking back at these super old decks to just see the random early cards. Like White Queen was just played as a 4-6 that would give you your biggest card. And oftentimes you'd be trying to see if your opponent has Leader or see what they have to maybe plan out your later turns. And then Shang-Chi here, of course, to just destroy our opponent's cards. But very funny deck, and very strong and mean deck from the very early days of Marvel Snap. Our final honorable mention is one that a deck that I really love, and a card that I really love. But there was a time where Arishem was just this absolute menace. And I really think that Arishem was a problem for a while, and they adjusted it a few times. But when Blob finally showed up, and Blob kind of got rid of the only bad matchup that Arishem used to have, which was Darkhawk. And then not only that, but Blob used to be able to be copied multiple times. So you could either copy Blob with Mystique or with Absorbing Man. So Arishem not only used to give you extra energy on turns 3 through 6 like it does now, you actually got it at the very beginning of the game. So cards like Agent Coulson were incredibly powerful in the early versions of Arishem, because on turn 2, you would just get 2 cards that you could curve out to, give you a little bit of randomness and fight back. But Arishem was always kept in check with Darkhawk. I believe Darkhawk's probably in this version of the list as a counter, because there was a time where Arishem was just everywhere. So even Arishem decks were running Darkhawk to fight against other Arishem decks. But Darkhawk used to be one of the really good ways that you could fight against Arishem, but because Blob would rip cards out of your deck, it would actually lower the power of Darkhawk. Blob used to have an ongoing ability where it couldn't get moved, which actually created this very interesting and probably not super intended interaction with Mystique, where if you would Mystique a Blob, not only would it copy the ability to not get moved, but it would also repeat the on-reveal effect. And not only that, but you could do it again with Absorbing Man. So, you know, Arishem has 6 energy on turn 5. You can play Blob. And then on turn 7, you could play both Mystique and Absorbing Man, basically clearing your entire deck. The limit to Blob used to be 15 for the power where it would stop eating. So it's even higher than it was now. And having that ongoing effect to be able to be copied by both Mystique and Absorbing Man just made it absolutely a menace to deal with. This was really when Airsham, I feel like, became like the biggest problem because you couldn't counter it with Darkhawk super easily because of how powerful Blob was. There was so much going on in here. And then there was the initial nerf, which was July 18th, which kind of stopped the bleeding a little bit, where they actually just got rid of Blob's ongoing ability, so you could only do it with Absorbing Mana if you were trying to do that strategy. So it lowered the amount of times you were able to get that Blob and then a second Blob trigger. And then Airsham, of course, was nerfed then at the end of that year on December 12th to only give you energy starting on the third turn. I think that Airsham is in a good space right now. It's not a super powerful deck, but I think that that's okay. I think that Airsham is something that should be a little bit more on the fun side. I do think that Airsham is like a very viable deck and still very powerful if you know how to use it right. But it's not to the point where you feel you have this insane advantage over your opponents while using Airsham like you used to. So that covers all of our honorable mentions, and now we are going to get into the 5 most crazy and unfair decks in Marvel Snap, starting with Alioth Control. Alioth is a card that has kind of been problematic since the very beginning. But this very first version of Alioth was just especially deadly. It was a 6 energy 5 power that said, destroy all cards that your opponent played here this turn. So you didn't have to have priority with the earlier version of Alioth. You didn't have to go through these steps to actually get control of the game to get Alioth's power. It didn't matter if you were behind, Alioth would just kill every single card they would play. They would play out cards, they would show up on the board, ooh, really scary, boom, Alioth, and then you would disappear them from the board. And this style of Alioth, man, just felt so bad to go up against. There was the Daredevil in here that you can use to get Professor X down and lock down a lane. And again, you might see like Juggernaut, Professor X. Oh, those don't work super well together. They sure did back then, because Professor X wouldn't allow any cards to actually move into that lane. So there was this extra level of being able to stop it. You had the Nebula in there, so if you were able to lock down a lane or use like Storm, the Nebula would just continue to grow and grow and grow. Jeff is in here to be able to get into your own Professor X lane or get into the lane that got stormed. But essentially, you just want to scam one lane early, usually with this. So you could just do like Storm and Juggernaut in a lane to stop them from being able to play there, get out ahead, and then just win at the end of the game with Alioth in devastating fashion. Man, Alioth was like, Alioth is annoying to deal with now, just shutting off your card's abilities, but it used to not even let them appear or anything. This card was so unbelievably broken, so unbelievably unfair to go up against. And boy, oh boy, this version of like the controlling style of Alioth just felt terrible. I might have said Airsham earlier, but I mean Alioth. This version of Alioth was just so degenerate and so hard to beat. There would be so many times we're just stuck in these checkmate positions where it's like, it doesn't matter what I do. There's only one lane I can play in. There's only one lane that they can play in. If they have Alioth, they'll just eat all of my cards and I'll be gone. Really annoying, really powerful deck. And then this deck has been nerfed twice, or the Alioth has been nerfed twice. First, they tried in December 4th to make Alioth both weaker. I believe it started at a 6-3, but it only destroyed unrevealed cards. And that was pretty nice, because I think that having this like cap end and rewarding you for getting ahead in the game is something that's interesting, but it just still felt so gross to go up against. And then it got changed again to what it is now, where it silences all cards that are played on April 10th. So boy, oh boy, if you hate Alioth now, let me tell you, if you were playing Marvel Snap back in 2023, I promise you hated it way worse then. Moving on to our number 4 deck, the original version of Galactus. It's funny, I feel like a lot of people think about me as like a Galactus player, or like say I'm this person who plays Galactus all the time. But back when Galactus was a 6-2, I basically just never played the card, because the way that this card used to be played is so different from what you have to do nowadays. The original version of Galactus was a 6 energy. I believe it started as a 6-3 and then it got changed to a 6-2. But the only thing that it said is that if this is your only card here, destroy all other locations. It didn't have the additional restriction of having to be ahead on power, which is what I think makes Galactus really interesting now, because not only do you have to play it and have be your only card there, but you also have to be winning when it goes off. And that did not used to be the case. So these older versions of Galactus played completely differently to how they do now. Essentially, what you were trying to do is just get Galactus off early and then just completely stop your opponents from playing. I'm actually looking at this now. There's a few different ways that this Galactus deck was played, but this one isn't even running the Spider-Man, which was very, very common. Oh yeah, I have ears. That's right. I just heard my headphones drop off, and I was like, why am I still wearing my headphones? I don't have to be. But this version of Galactus doesn't even run the Spider-Man, where you could basically wave into Galactus and then play Spider-Man, which doesn't have an ability anywhere near what it does now. Spider-Man's ability used to just be web up your opponent's location. They can't play their next turn. So if you'd play Wave on 3, Galactus on 4, and then Spider-Man on 5, boom, you have a 6th turn and your opponent does not, because they cannot play. There was also a lot of other really devilish things that this deck does. So what you would very often do is play Electro on 3, and then with 5 energy on turn 4, you would opt to play either Dr. Octopus to pull all of your opponent's cards into a lane where you didn't care about because you were playing Galactus, to basically get rid of any counters they might have, like Shang-Chi or other ways that your opponent could try and stop you, and then play Galactus on 5, destroy all those other locations so that Doc Ock doesn't matter, but you basically emptied their hand. And then you could use things like Death and Null. Like Death and Null would get so much bigger because you Doc Ock a different lane and then blow up all of those cards, and Death would get way, way cheap, so you can combine all these other things. And all of this was with 6/9 America Chavez as well. If you don't remember America Chavez's original ability, it would stay in your deck until turn 6, and you would draw it on turn 6. So not only was this a really devastating combo when it came together, but because Chavez would stay in your deck, it would make you more likely to draw all of the other cards in your decks between turns 1 and 5, and give you more percentage chance of actually landing this combo. So it was just super, super annoying to deal with. Like the Nulls would just be massive that they would play after the Galactus. You'd have your hand either completely silent so it couldn't stop it, or you'd have Doc Ock have all of your cards get pulled away from your hand. Sometimes these decks would run Wolverine to explode, and then you have a little bit more power into that Galactus lane when it comes. But this was just a very unfun way of playing the game, in my opinion. Like this was like the closest that Marvel Snap has ever had to like a solitaire style deck, where you don't really care what your opponent's doing. You're just going to do whatever you want. You're either going to wave Galactus and then like Leech, or you're going to Electro and then Leech and then Galactus, or you're going to like wave Galactus and then Spider-Man and stop them from playing. Really just like completely changing the rules of Marvel Snap. And I'm really, really happy that they changed Galactus, because I think that the Galactus animation is awesome. I think that the ability to destroy all the other locations is super unique and really, really cool. But there has to be that level of counterplay. And I think Galactus has a ton of counterplay nowadays. There's lots of different ways that you can stop your opponents from making you kneel. But back then, there was really nothing that you could do. I remember I used to run like Polaris in almost every deck because I hated getting Galactus so much that I would just try and have priority and then play Polaris to move one of their cards into the lane that they were going to Galactus. So essentially, you just have to run counters to this deck or just take the L against it. Now, this deck never really had really high cube rates. It had decently high win rates, but, you know, often if you get like Spider-Man and stop from being able to play, you would just, you know, kind of let that go, right? But overall, this deck just felt terrible to go up against. This was finally nerfed on June 12th, 2023, where they made the change to it to be a 6/7, that you actually have to be winning the lane as well. And I think that this is one of the best changes they've ever made to a card. It went from this like really just toxic solitaire style deck to a pretty dynamic and interesting card that you had to you know, use some level of confusion for your opponents and try and get out ahead to get that huge payoff of Galactus destroying the other lanes and giving you an advantage there. But the original version of Galactus was a very, very unfair deck. We're going to be moving into the top 3, and these top 3 decks represent, in my opinion, the 2 absolute worst metas in Marvel Snap history. I love this game. I'm someone who has been just super, super positive about it because I really do feel like this is incredibly well balanced, well-made game that's super, super fun. But there have been 2 times where I really felt like I just didn't want to go and play the game anymore because of how bad the meta got, because of these just Goliath decks that were all overseeing of everything, and it felt absolutely impossible to beat. And the first one that we're going to be talking about is Thanos Lockjaw. Boy, oh boy, this deck was crazy. Thanos has changed a bunch over the years. This version of Thanos Lockjaw was available when it was a 6/8, and then it also got buffed to a 6/11, kind of right after this like style of deck got discovered. But a few important cards to talk about that were a lot different back then. Thanos Stones were quite a bit different. I think they were a little bit more powerful. In general, they had better draw power than they do now. But the big card that was much, much different was Lockjaw. So Lockjaw has gone through a lot of different changes, and they've tried to adjust it in a few different ways. Now it's the activate card that can send a card into your deck and flip it. But what Lockjaw used to do is every time you would play a card there, it would swap it with a card in your deck. It would basically be like the what is it called? Quantum dimension? I don't know. Tell me down in the comments. It's whichever location swaps a card for a card in your deck. So Lockjaw would basically give you a asymmetrical version of that on your side. And how this deck would excel, Quinjet used to this 1/2 Quinjet that's in here. It used to hit the stones because Quinjet didn't used to have the restriction that the cards can only cost 1. They used to go to 0. So Quinjet in these Thanos decks would make all of Thanos stones free. So you can just play out the stones whenever you get them once you have Quinjet down. If you have Lockjaw down as well, you can just load up and play a bunch of them all at the same time and flip a bunch of cards into your deck. I have this seared into my memory of playing against the Thanos deck where I was winning a lane by like, I think 30 points. And they were playing a very similar list to this. And then they played Lockjaw and 3 stones. And those 3 stones turned into like Infinite, Magneto, and She-Hulk. And I just went from being like, oh, surely they can't win this lane, to just from hand play a bunch of just super cheap, nothing cards and flip them into massive cards. A couple other really annoying cards in this deck was the Leech. The Leech was annoying not only because you could just play Leech into the Lockjaw, it would do its on reveal, which would silence your opponent's entire hand, get rid of all ongoing all abilities in your opponent's hand, all of them, is what it used to do. And then it would flip into the deck and get stronger. But also, if you played like Quinjet and then on turn 3 you play Lockjaw and you play a stone into Lockjaw, sometimes the Leech comes out, and not only do you get Leech, but you get Leeched on turn 3 before you even like had a chance to set up or play any of your powerful cards. Just a crazy deck to go up against. It ran armor to defend its cards, Devil Dinosaur because it was much easier to draw with the Thanos stones back then. Again, America Chavez, which is a mainstay in a lot of these decks just because it helps the consistency. People might not really think about why America Chavez being in your deck and only being drawn on turn 6 would be good, but it just gives you a slight increase on the percentage of drawing all of your cards early, and just gives you so much more early consistency. And it actually gave you a pretty much higher chance of getting a drawing Thanos stone on turn 1 by taking 1 card out of the equation of cards that you could draw. It's funny, the Infinite is in here. It's literally just in here for Lockjaw. There's no other way to play the Infinite. You would never skip with this deck. It was just a high roll for Lockjaw that you would put in there, and it worked. It worked, and it hurt really bad. Couple other cards in here, Blue Marvel, just because you're playing a lot of cards out. The She-Hulk was nice in here. Sometimes, you'd just be playing some setup and drawing some cards, so you'd skip some energy, which is why the Sunspot's in here too. Then you could just play the She-Hulk for cheap along with some other things. And then the Magento was just one of the stronger cards back then. But boy, oh boy, I just remember going up against this deck so many times, and it just felt so frustrating. It's also interesting because Thanos just took a while for people to truly understand how to unlock its power. It came out, and like I said, it actually got like buffed right after this deck got discovered, because they had already planned to buff it to 6/11, and then this deck started to see some rounds, and then it just gets buffed by an extra 3 power. You never really played Thanos back then. Sometimes it would pop out of the Lockjaw, but you wouldn't really want to be playing it from hand from this deck. But boy, oh boy, this deck was so tough to beat. It felt like it kind of had answers for everything. You'd be getting leeched early. Your opponent would play massive amounts of power that was all random on the final turn. This deck was incredibly annoying. And not only was it incredibly annoying, but you might see that this got nerfed on April 17th when Lockjaw made it so you can only do it one time per turn, really lowered the power level of this deck. But there was another deck that was nerfed on April 17th. The very first meta that I hated and made me not want to play the game was dictated by this Thanos Lockjaw list, as well as this Shuri Red Skull list, which was also nerfed on April 17th. Uh, it was like these two decks were like S plus tier and everything else was B or less. These decks felt so unbelievably oppressive and so hard to beat. So a few things about Shuri that are a little bit different than it is now. So you might see it's a 4-2 and it's like, oh, Shuri is a 4-3 now. Why was this so strong? You used to be able to play the card after playing Shuri anywhere. So you could play Shuri, or you could play Cosmo on 3, let's say, play Shuri somewhere else, and then play a giant card on top of Cosmo so that they can't Shadow King it, or they can't Shang-Chi it, or they can't affect it. I don't think Shadow King existed back then. Or it was the 4-3 Shadow King, which it just isn't real. But basically, Shang-Chi was back then pretty much played in almost every deck. So this deck would run Armor and Cosmo, so you get one of those down on turn 1 or turn 2, and then you play the Shuri, and then you would send either a Red Skull or a Vision into that Shuri lane, get them pretty big, and then you would Taskmaster it on the final turn, and sometimes add something like Titania or Zero to give you a little bit of extra power. And then there was another mode that you could go into where you could Shuri on 4, you could pass on turn 5, have your She-Hulk go down to 1 energy, and then play both She-Hulk and Taskmaster on the final turn, because Taskmaster used to be a 5-0. Again, just a really, really nasty deck to deal with. You might think oh, you're sharing a Red Skull, you're getting, I believe it was 26 power. There was times where it was 26 and times when it was 28 when Red Skull was 14. But you basically get this giant card, and you'd think that 28 power, but you're also giving your opponent power on their side of the board. We were just much slower back then. You didn't have the cards or the ability to accelerate out as much power into locations back then. Is over 2 years ago that you can now. So there was just nothing that could deal with the pure raw stat output of Shuri, and the fact that you could play Armor or Cosmo, play down Shuri, and then play that giant card into a lane where it can't get Shang-Chi'd, just made it feel like there was almost no way of fighting against this onslaught of a deck. A very, very annoying deck to go against as someone who, again, was just loving playing random different decks, and I always have. A deck like this just felt like there was simply nothing that you could do. They would just play 26 power in 2 lanes after playing some other small things like a Zero Titania early, or maybe Zero into Lizard to get you a few points in a couple different lines. I'm pretty sure that the Polaris that's in here was probably to fight against Galactus, which is hilarious. But boy, oh boy, what a absolutely nasty deck. And again, this month where the entire ladder was either that Lockjaw Thanos deck or the Shuri Red Skull deck just felt so terrible to go up against. It felt like you had no chance unless you were either hyper focused on countering one or both of those decks, or you were just playing one of those decks, and the decks themselves would then kind of have some counters, built-in counters, the leech that was in the Lockjaw deck. I feel was really good against stopping the Taskmaster from the Shuri deck. So these two decks were just at the top of everything, and it felt so impossible to play anything else. And then this was also nerfed on April 17th, where Shuri would only allow you to play the card on top of it. So it basically, because Shang-Chi was so popular, it took this deck from being able to either have Armor or Cosmo and very easily get it off and have a good level of misdirection, being very, very, show you exactly where they're going to play the card, because they have to play Shuri and then play the big card right on top of it, like we see now. So really just lowered the power level there and the output of the deck, and really brought it in line. So this nerfs that happened on April 17th, I would say, is probably the second most important and impactful round of nerfs that they've ever done. But next, we're going to talk about the worst deck to go against of all time. Whenever people talk about the worst metas ever, I will always talk about the month that we had to deal with the Zabu Absman combo. This deck was so unbelievably unfair. So let's talk about Zabu to start. So Zabu used to be a 3-2. Talked about this in a previous Bynx Bants that gave -2 to all of your 4-cost cards. So just an insane amount of energy acceleration that you could do. You could play out Zabu, then you could play 2 4-drops on turn 4. You could play 2 4-drops on turn 5. You could play 3 4-drops on the final turn. You would just get so unbelievably far ahead that it just felt so hard to beat. But not only that, you would use these insanely degenerate combos. So Spider-Man used to web up your opponent's side of the board. So it was an on reveal that would stop your opponent from playing somewhere on the next turn. So essentially what these Zabu decks would do, they'd play out Zabu and then, I don't know, they'd throw something out there, maybe play a rock slide. And then on turn 5, they would play Spider-Man on one lane and they would Absorbing Man the other lane, stopping you completely from playing in those 2 lanes for the rest of the game. And you could do things like Leader, stealing all of your opponent's cards. Arrow would move all of your opponent's cards back then. It wasn't a card that only took some cards. It took everything. It was crazy. And then not only that, you'd be able to use 4-1 Darkhawk. The fact that Darkhawk came out as 4-1 was crazy. It was basically like a base 4-7 that you can get better by playing Korg or Rock Slide. So it was just super easy. Even if you didn't hit Zabu with this deck, you could just play like Korg and then Scorpion, which again looks weird on here, but it was just the best way that you could play a 2-drop. It was like just one of the more consistent 2-drops that you could play. Then you could just go into like a Darkhawk game plan and feel okay. And this deck, it was so prevalent. Everyone was playing this deck that the deck started using counters. You would use Enchantress to stop your opponent's Zabu. You'd use Cosmo to protect your own Zabu from your opponent's Enchantress because everyone was playing these decks. And then you could use Leader to just steal everything. You could use Shang-Chi to blow up any big cards that were in your way. I cannot express to you enough how unfun it felt playing Marvel Snap and every other time you would queue running into this Zabu Absorbing Man Spider-Man combo. It felt like you had absolutely no agency on winning. The only thing you could do was throw as many counters against this as possible and just hope that it works. I remember my very first Zabu deck that I had. I played Zabu and I played Rouge that could steal Zabus, and then I played 10 4-drops, including Super Scroll, to steal my opponent's Zabu to get even more and just be able to burst everything out. What an insane deck that existed for a very short amount of time. This was the January season pass card and was nerfed in February. It's probably good that something like this happened because I think that it really like woke the devs up to releasing cards like this, because there's never been another card like Zabu that was just so unbelievably broken. Everyone in the community was saying this card is going to be broken. This is going to be a massive problem. They shouldn't release this card how it is. They did. Everything was proven right. Everyone was playing this deck. And boy, I have so much PTSD from that month between the early January and February 7th of just having to play against this exact combo every other game. And always remember, if you are upset about metas or what's happening in Marvel Snap, just remember it used to be so much worse. There's a reason that there's no decks from like the last year that's on here, because there's never really been a situation where a deck has risen to the power level as any of these that I've talked about is. And I think that's a huge testament to the Snap balance team to have these mistakes early on and do these things early on, and then get very good at kind of balancing the ecosystem of Snap and making it so that a lot more decks feel fair or at least competitive. But boy, oh boy, I tell you what, just be lucky if you weren't there that you never had to deal with your opponent stopping you from playing the game on turn 6 in all the lanes, and then the lane that you play, they just leader all the cards there and steal all of them anyway. It was really tough to deal with. So I am so happy that I never have to deal with, especially like these top 3. These decks give me so much PTSD just remembering how absolutely unbeatable they felt. And I think that we've come a long way. But thank you so much for enjoying the featured section. Let's start talking about what's going on in Marvel Snap this week. So we have 4 new cards this week, which is really exciting. We have Maverick, Marrow, the Fastball Special, Wild Child, and then we're going to be talking about Weapon H that was here last week and talk about how good it's been doing. And then we're also going to go into the news and updates, talking about Team Clash. So first things first, let's talk about Maverick. I'm actually pretty excited. I was on the Snapchat that came out today with Alex, but last night we got to sit down and talk about a lot of these cards a little bit more, so we got to bounce some ideas off each other. But Maverick is a 3 energy, 3 power card with the ability activate, give the next card you play power equal to this card's power. So in general, what you want to do with Maverick is get it a little bit bigger usually, and then put that into something that can continue to multiply it. I think there's a lot of different ways that you can utilize Maverick, some of which are a little bit more meaty and fun, and some of them are probably really competitive. And Alex really pushed this idea of Surfer, which, I mean, it's kind of like a card that, it's a 3 cost. There's always the meme that any 3 cost card, oh, is this a Surfer card? This card actually does some pretty amazing things for Surfer, being able to like ping pong power around the board. So any power that gets added into Maverick, you can then add to the next card. You can multiply that amount of power. It can be really, really strong. So like instead of just going Forge into Brood, now maybe you go Forge into Maverick, making Maverick a 3/5. Then you activate Maverick, and then you get +5 on your Brood and make a massive Brood and Broodlings onto a different board. Maybe you're running things like Galacta, where you can Galacta into a Maverick and then spread that on the final turn, push that power even further. Or maybe you're running Gwenpool that can hit Maverick on 4, and then you play it down on turn 5. So I do think that this deck really fits the mold of like a classic Surfer deck, being able to multiply that power, push it to things like maybe Captain Carter, or obviously Brood or Shaw, to be able to give it an additional buff on top of it. So I think this is going to be a really, really good card in Surfer. And then other decks that might want to run this would be ones that want to push out power without, necessarily having it being on reveal. Maybe you want to add a power to a card on the final turn, but you don't want to play the card on turn 5. You can play Maverick out early and then get that power later. You're kind of like banking up power that you can push to some of your other cards. But what I'm really excited about with Maverick, though, is building a basically Rube Goldberg machine where you get multiple Jocastas and a Maverick all in one lane. You activate them all. You get a bunch of power ready to rock. And then you play Galactus onto a lane. You get like a +15 power Galactus to just absolutely crush your opponent's dreams in a lane. That's what I'm excited to do with the card, and what I'm probably going to mess with it with. But just a really interesting and powerful card. As far as like, should you go and get this card right away? This might be a card that you want to wait on a little bit and see how it fits into these other decks and how they fit into the meta. I do think that the card is going to be quite strong, but I don't know if it's something that's going to be super meta relevant right away that you want to push out. But this is going to be the Series 5 card for this month. And we also have a Series 4 card coming out this month, Marrow, like Bone Marrow, which is a 2 energy, 3 power card with the ability, when discarded or destroyed, randomly split -7 power among enemy cards. So this is another payoff of a card that can either get discarded or destroyed. So we have things like Proxima Midnight that can get helped out with discard. And then, for instance, Bucky Barnes on the destroy side. There's actually a pretty big sect of cards that can work with both discard or destroy. We're looking at things like Wolverine, like Dakin, like X-23 that can use both of these different abilities. And we're getting this card as well as Wild Child, which we'll discuss later, that is really trying to push this archetype of doing both, which I think is quite interesting. The only real deck that's utilized both of these to a lot of effect would be like a Morgan Le Fay style list, where you can either pull your discarded cards or destroyed. And like some of those lists, you'd run like Carnage and Killmonger, but also like a Bullseye to be able to destroy or to discard some cards, or maybe like a Blade and then resummon them into your hand. So Marrow actually works really well with that, because it's something that you can either destroy or discard. You get an additional effect. And then if Morgan Le Fay brings it back to your hand, then you have a 2/6 to play later on in the game, which you can even destroy or discard again to get even more activations of this. How powerful is this card going to be? I'm not quite sure. I believe that Weapon H, which we'll talk about a little bit later, how it did its first week, kind of like represented another way that you can play discard, which is more of like a tempo focused discard, where you're just discarding a bunch of stuff, getting a bunch of points, being able to like res stuff with things like Khonshu to just bring them back in case you run into discarding the wrong cards. But Marrow is kind of a nice card that you can discard, but then also gets brought back into your actual like discard pile, quote unquote, that you can hold on to. So that can help with things like Khonshu, which sometimes if you're only discarding cards that like return to your hand or go onto the board, you're not actually adding cards into your discard pile. Maybe Marrow can help out with that. But I do think that this card is interesting, and having like -7 that immediately gets hit, like in many ways, this is very similar to Proxima Midnight, right? Like Proxima Midnight is giving you a 7 power card on your side of the board, whereas this is just taking 7 power and putting it on your opponent's side. And it's easier to play if you don't get that, and there's multiple ways to do it with both discard and destroyed. So I'm not super sold on this card, but I do think with some additional cards that are coming both this week and later that can use both discard and destroy, I do think that that archetype is something that people are going to be puzzling around with a lot more. Next up, we're going to talk about Fastball Special, which is my #1 card of this week. I think that this card is absolutely incredible. It's a 2-cost skill that says on reveal, destroy your highest power card here to afflict an enemy card here with that much negative power. So cards like Venom are so important for destroy because not only can you get destroy triggers on cards, you're able to maintain the amount of power that was in that lane while lowering the amount of cards that are in that lane. So, you can kind of consolidate a lane with Venom. You get some destroy triggers, but also you get to keep all of that power so you don't feel so bad like using a Carnage to destroy a card that has a lot of power because you get to continue and hold on to that power. And Fastball Special does the exact same thing, except instead of having it maintain on power on your side of the board, it's maintained by adding negative power to your opponent's side of the board, which even goes further in being able to help you have more board space available. I think that this card is real scary. I think that this card has so many different use cases. One thing that I want to point out with this card that I think a lot of people are overlooking is that destroy as an archetype has kind of had like the same few cards as like the staples for a long time, like Carnage and Venom, and then Deathlock if you need another destroy trigger. But really, the cheapest way to destroy a card immediately has always been Carnage. There's no other 2-cost card that you can play down and get like an immediate destroy trigger on something. And Fastball Special is the first card since the very release of the game that does that. Obviously, there's like Kid Omega or things that destroy things conditionally, but just being able to play a card out of your hand for 2 power for 2 cost and to be able to destroy a card immediately is something that we really haven't had access to in the past. So not only is this going to be good with, things like Shuri Nimrod, where you Shuri and then you Nimrod, you get a big Nimrod. You can use this to destroy the Nimrod, get 2 more Nimrods, and then throw that negative power somewhere else. Just a lot of things you can do with it. It works great with Adamantium Rejuvenation, where you can play Fastball Special and Adamantium Rejuvenation on the same turn. This is a 2-cost and a 4-cost where you blow up your biggest card, you pop it, but you add that negative power to your opponent's side, and then you resummon a doubled version of it somewhere else. So you can be like super ahead in one lane, and then you maintain that lead in that lane while also getting double whatever the power was into a different lane. The other really big use case for this is, of course, one of my favorite cards in the game, Galactus. Boy, oh boy, I know that I was talking about Galactus and how it was evil. That was the early version of Galactus, because nowadays there's an additional condition where not only does it have to be the only card in a lane, but it has to be winning that lane. Fastball Special opens up so many avenues for Galactus to surprise you and just sneak up on you on ways that you are completely not expecting. And it can either be from being really far ahead in a lane, and then Fastball Specialing there and then playing Galactus later, or if you utilize things like Wave, so you can Wave on turn 5 and then Fastball Special a lane and then Galactus it at the same time. It is so much more evil to Galactus when you have a card in a lane, you get rid of it and Galactus on the same turn, because it's so unbelievably hard for your opponent to play around that. I've played some like Merlin Galactus decks that have some very similar ways that you can do things, where you would use Once and Future All to put a card from a lane back into your deck, clearing that lane and opening it up to Galactus there. And Fastball Special just absolutely does it on steroids. So I'm looking at this from a Galactus perspective to either be a little bit cloggy and then just be able to destroy something and then Galactus, or to be able to ramp out and play this and Galactus on the same lane. I think that this card is going to find so much use in so many ways. I think it's very, very special. It's very fun. It's going to support some really creative plays. I'm super, super excited for it. And this card is going to be easy to obtain because it's going to be part of the limited time game mode. The final card is also going to be part of that limited time game mode, Team Clash, coming up later this month, and it is Wild Child. is a 2 energy 1 power card with the ability Ongoing, +4 power if you discarded a card, and +4 power if one of your cards has been destroyed. So if you either get a discard or a destroy trigger, this is a 2/5, but if you get both, it's a conditional 2/9, which is very, very strong. Looking at like almost chamber levels. I think the good comparison to this would be like Goliath. Goliath tends to get that big when you're running a deck with a ton of different ongoing cards. But boy, oh boy, this is kind of a card that pushing you towards wanting to try and have a deck that will discard and destroy cards. We have tons of cards that actually work with that. Again, you know, you have the whole Wolverine family, X-23, Wolverine, and Dakin. The Shard from Dakin can be both discarded or destroyed. Wolverine can be both discarded and destroyed to get it activated. Same thing with X-23. We saw the Marrow from earlier that has a very similar ability. So I think that they're really trying to push this idea of a new archetype that is a combination of discard and destroy, which I think is really cool. You know, Wolverine has had this ability forever and has pretty much only been used in destroy. Dakin has had this ability forever. It's pretty much only been used in discard. So really trying to push these new tools that super encourages you to do both, I think is really, really awesome. So I think the Wild Child is going to be pretty powerful. It is a huge incentive to want to try and do both a discard and a destroy because you get access to this 2/9. Like a 2/9 is really, really good, especially just like playing at the end of the game and just surprising your opponent that for only 2 energy you can slam down a 9 power card. It works with Ravonna. I don't know how important that will be, but that was always something with Goliath that was really strong in my opinion, is the fact that it works so well with Ravonna, being able to play as a 1 cost for another ongoing card. So that's a little bit niche, but really excited to see what this card brings. And again, this card is going to be available through the limited time game mode coming later this month. So super excited for these 4 cards coming out this week. I think there's going to be a lot of different things to mess around with. And again, I think that Fastball Special, this card is going to be nasty, and I'm so excited to try it. So really excited for these new cards that are coming out. And let's talk about last week's card. We had Weapon H, which was the 7 energy 14 power card with the ability, when discarded, put this back with -2 cost. So it is a card that you can just kind of try and discard as many times as you can. I really liked it with like a more tempo style of discard where you just kind of have this in your hand. You're playing things like Corvus and MODOK and Zombie Power Man, just discard. And very often you'd find this as like a 3/14 in your hand, or sometimes like just after Corvus, you'll discard it one time and then on turn 4, you'll play this for as a 5/14 and just feel pretty darn good about it. And the stats are honestly better than I thought. For all my stats, I always used the last 7 days, and we're looking at the top 50% of Infinite to look at the highest level of play, while also getting rid of the people who are like towards the bottom of Infinite. Some of them are just like booster farming and things like that, so the data gets a little bit funky. We're looking at just under a 51% win rate with an average cubes of 0.02. 12.5% popularity. A lot of people are really liking playing Weapon H, and it's seen playing multiple things, like more the tempo style discard like I was talking about, but even some people are finding good use cases for it in more traditional style of discard with like the Dracula and the Apocalypse. It's just an additional way to get value, or sometimes just a card that, you know, maybe you get your Apocalypse really big and you don't need your Dracula to hit it, and you have this big old Weapon H still hanging on your hand, so you can just play that Apocalypse somewhere else and then have the Weapon H get hit by the Dracula and only get 14 power. So really cool card. I don't think that I think that, like, when I originally looked at this and when I talked about this card with Alex on the Snapchat, I'm not super sold. This is a card that you really want to go after, but it is a really good card if you enjoy the discard archetype that allows you to play things a little bit differently. The last thing we're going to talk about today is Team Clash. Team Clash is coming out December 18th. It's going to run for 10 days, so it's going to be a limited time game mode that's around for quite a while. The idea of Team Clash is that there's 5 different teams of iconic Marvel characters. So there's like the Thunderbolts, there's the Avengers, there's the Spider-Verse, and each of them has 6 core members who have brand new abilities. So we can see on the bottom left here, we have the Avengers team, Team Clash Hawkeye, which is on reveal if you play a card here next turn +2 power. But if it's an Avenger, you repeat this ability. So kind of a card that you can, it's a little bit weaker on the front end, like the original Hawkeye, but if you hit it multiple times and get really strong. And the way that you are able to build your decks is that you can either use a pre-constructed deck that they allow you to do, or you pick one of the teams, you get those 6 unique cards with new abilities that are like the core members of the team. You can build the rest of the deck however you want. So you can tech for certain things, or just go all in and use different versions of that team than the pre-builds that are on there. And then each team also has a unique mechanic that incentivizes using team members. For instance, like the Avengers one, it's like if you play the Avengers in a lane, give another Avenger +1 power. The Spider-Verse one, it's like you get additional energy if you move a spider card. So there's all these different mechanics that are connected to these new cards as well. And it kind of incentivizes you to not just use the 6 core cards and then just play another 6 most powerful cards in the game. It actually does encourage you to try and use more of those team members that aren't part of that 6 core to get the unique mechanic that every team has. So I'm excited to play this. I think that this is cool. I love the idea of having a customizable deck, but having 6 cards be locked that you kind of have to build around. I think that it encourages you to team build a little bit differently, because I feel like in a lot of the other limited time modes where you can just kind of construct them however you want, would really like emulate what you would be doing on ladder. But then just like, for like the old Grand Arena where you could play whatever you want, you just kind of use a skill that would work pretty well with it. There was a little bit less like creativity that you had to do, but having like these 6 cards locked and then having 6 cards that you can add almost kind of feels like Airshim in a way, right? Like you get like some random cards, but then you also have the cards that you add into your deck. So I really, really like this idea. I like that they're being a little bit risky with how they're doing these limited time modes and doing things a little bit differently. I think that that's really cool. I like the unique mechanics that they're doing with it, and I like that they're actually creating new versions of cards to be able to use in that mode. I think that's a cool way to be able to use familiar feeling characters, but have them do things a little bit differently. I just hope it doesn't break the game for the other versions of the cards, because that's what sometimes happens when they add all these different versions. But super, super excited for this. I think it'll be great. And then you can also get 2 really awesome cards from this. The Fastball Special, which I legitimately think might be one of the best cards of the month, if not, but definitely like the best card from this week. Then you also get Wild Child, which opens up those discard and destroy synergy. So both those will be earnable through the limited time mode starting on December 8th. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I've really loved doing this. Shout out to, again, Alex Kocha for having me on the Snapchat. If you're here because of me being on there earlier, say what up in the comments. I really, really appreciate that. And then let me know down in the comments below if there's something else that I can kind of bring from my bank of knowledge from beta that you would find interesting to see as a viewer, like I've done with cards that are completely different, or cards that or like decks that were super, super powerful here. I really, really like, doing this research and digging into it. So if you have any suggestions, I'm super, super open to them. Make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. And I'll see ya in the next one. Peace. Bynx. I hope you like the vibe. Bynx. Like and subscribe.